This is not the Unreal Tournament of my day, right? Where like you'd shoot somebody and they wouldn't even have ragdoll physics. They would just kind of like do a death animation of like laying down while flying off of the map. Butterscotch. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 482 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast. Butterscotch
comedy podcast.
Look, I've barely done this. I've only done this a few times. Okay, you know you can't hold me to a high standard. Anyways,
do you know what episode you started on? Because we're at 482 right now. I think it was in the 60s.
I think you took.
Probably I've done this 400 times at least.
Yeah,
but you know, let's not worry about that. Anyway, my name's Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam. I'm the miscellaneous programmer. I'm just all thrown off now.
Same, I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's August 23rd, 22 by 4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show, so enjoy that. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. So we're just going to do questions.
Questions.
Been a bit.
We almost started one last week, but
did we almost start one?
We couldn't make it.
I think we said we were I think we said last week we're like, we'll get half a question in there at the end, and then we just weren't even close.
Well, I think framing it as almost starting it is more positive than we definitely just didn't do it, because we almost started one. I feel pretty good about that. So the highest upvoted question from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net is from CooCooCachoo, who says, "Can Sam please, for the love of God, introduce himself as, and I'm Sam, the artist with programmer."
My ears are your grammar, Sam.
Hold on, let me finish the question.
I thought that was over.
My ears are restless each and every week, hoping for this phonetic masterpiece of an intro. Now, don't be wisecracks and say, Sam can, but he will never. Just deliver the intro soundbite my ears need. Forever yours, CooCooCachoo.
I could say it for you, but we could talk about it.
Let's try it out and see how it sounds. So we'll do the regular intro.
Okay, let's try. We'll rehearse.
Do you remember your line? You memorized?
Yeah, I think so. I think I got it.
Okay. All right. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I do all kinds of weird stuff.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist with good grammar.
Oh, man.
Programmer. Nope. Well, I feel like we got close enough for this person to be satisfied.
I think the question is like an artist with programmer. You know what I mean?
I think it's because sometimes Adam calls himself a web programmer. I say I'm the game programmer. And since you don't say programmer at the end, it just doesn't work,
Yeah.
So,
but you're out there doing spine stuff and what is art but a series of steps, which is just an algorithm. So in the end, you're sort of kind of an artist programmer.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I mean, it's kind of, I guess I'm kind of hung up on the programmer thing.
Program, like good grammar.
Is that for grammar or good at grammar?
I think that's what I think saying with programmer feels like you're not good at grammar. You know what I mean? With programmer. With programmer.
I don't know anybody who has programmer. Having programmer implies that you get paid just to have grammar.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think that's what I'm kind of hung up on. It's like the truthiness.
Which,
here's the
sure,
job
you could
of
say
an editor, I guess.
No, because an editor isn't just about, they have to have good grammar, but there's more to it. There's more to it than that.
Well, that's why I say
everybody
has
has
artist
good grammar.
With programmer, because there's more to it than just the grammar part.
Yeah, but it doesn't really come through in his art very well, I feel, his grammar. So I don't think that Sam gets paid for his grammar nearly as much.
That's true.
As other things.
In fact, I basically do not follow any conventions when it comes to naming things in the art files themselves. I'm sort of like
I would assert that
amateur.
Sam does not have programmer because there's a certain phrase that Sam uses. A lot of people use this phrase, and every time I hear it, my eyeballs turn inside out. Okay.
Is it I apostrophe S? Is that the
yes?
one? Yeah.
It's a possessive I, which I cannot abide. Yeah, if you say Diana and I's house, right? But it's Diana's and my house because the rule is that if you take out either person, it should still work. And you
Everybody
never
knows
say,
the rule.
welcome to I's house.
Here's the thing. If it's like slang, language isn't actually ruled. It's not hard.
Yeah, the question
rules.
is,
It's
are you a
evolving all the time.
prescriptivist or are you a descriptivist? If you're a prescriptivist when it comes to language, and that means you say, here's the rules as if they grew on a tree and like are just the fundamental truth of reality, right? And then you apply those and you say, and this is where you get your fights where you're like, oh, the only real English is English from the English region of England or whatever, versus the fact that, language is just different wherever you go. There's different ways
Well, I
to
think
pronounce
this is a
things and
cop
so on
out.
and so forth.
Because, for example, you can't just like rearrange the words in a sentence and be like, there's no rules. You can't be like, my welcome to house.
See, now you're slippery sloping. Nobody
you
said
slippery
there's
slope.
no rules.
Of course I am. I live on the slippery slope. I love skiing.
But it sounds like you live on the bottom of the slope. So I think you like hanging out, drinking milk chocolate in the
I'm just
in the
saying,
little hut,
know,
criticizing everybody who's skiing down the slope.
I'm just saying you guys are grammar anarchists, and I won't stand for it. Okay?
No.
I'm a man of the law.
Well, here, maybe I'll say this part about this
Of
whole
which
grammar
law?
thing, which is that part of what I think also trips me about it is it sound. When you say like mother with child, artist with programmer feels kind of the same, and so I'm like, who's this other person involved? Where are they? What do we talk? Do I have one? Just
Maybe,
I see.
maybe
so
it's-
you're pregnant.
I'm pregnant with a programmer, I
program.
guess. But I'm like,
I see.
That's why. Yeah, the whole thing's just there's a lot.
Maybe
of
it's
layers
just
going on.
maybe it's just a reference to Seth again. Because Seth comes in and he's like, "Hey, I'm the games programmer," and you're like, "Oh, I'm the artist with programmer." Although now there's kind of a grammar.
We do
problem there, 'cause there
sometimes
should be
work
a
together.
the
Can I say
there.
with programmers? Because there's two.
with programmers. Yeah, that would work. I would do it.
Sam has sort of a harem of programmers.
Dude, I'm just collecting them all. They're like Pokemon. I want one for like some web stuff. I want a game programming one. I hear there's some other kinds out there. I don't know what they are.
There's
but I
at
heard
least
they are.
like two other kinds of programmer. Probably
There's at least two.
mainframe. That's a pretty good one. That's a hard get. That
This
one.
idea
That's
of being
like a
pregnant
shiny
with
Pokemon.
being pregnant with a programmer, imagining like the doctor's doing an ultrasound and they're like, I have bad news. Your child is inverting a binary tree.
Yep.
They're gonna be a programmer. I'm sorry. They're gonna get laid off. It's just
That's
immediately.
very true, actually. Yeah.
Yep.
Tech industry
Yep.
going through some stuff right now. Whew.
It is. All right. Well, anyway, let's get on to the next question.
Yeah, let's go.
That one was hyper specific, and I can't believe that was the highest upvoted question. But apparently, this is an overwhelmingly popular opinion that people hold. So, all right. Next question comes from Challosis, who says, "How do you write a big story? Is it easy to forget things or contradict yourself?"
Ooh.
I mean,
How do you
the
write a
latter
big
part's pretty
story?
easy. Yes.
I'd say it's easy to do that kind of all the time. You know what I mean?
Even
that's
in a
also
small story.
Yep.
Sometimes I forget what I wrote at the beginning of a sentence when I get to the end of it.
Yep. That's why you don't do the run-ons. Run-on sentences. Very prone for that sort of thing.
What's the saying? Why use many word when few words do trick?
Exactly.
But there are three parts to this, right? Because there's scale of story, which then the more stuff there is, the harder to keep track of. There's the timeline along which creating the story takes place. So that stuff you wrote a year ago, you might have forgotten about, right? And then there is the fact that not one person's writing it. So different people are contributing different parts of the story. And so you might not even know. So there's like the stuff that you theoretically know about, but could have forgotten easily. And then there's the stuff you don't even know about. And then you're trying to keep track of all of that and become aware of stuff that you didn't even know you should be aware of while you're adding new stuff, which is all to say.
This is really,
very
it comes down to ownership. Okay. So what we've kind of found is that you still want to have one person who is at the nexus, one person who knows everything. This is the narrative director or narrative designer or whatever you want to call them. They know everything about the story. They have the story Bible, the lore Bible, whatever. For us in Crashlands 2, that's Jen. And so the way that we kind of develop things is if Sam or I, are playing through the game, we're working on some new content and we start working on something that's going to bump up against the story. where it's like, okay, we need a new area that, that we're going to build out for this next new section of new creatures and resources or something. Where are we in the story at this point? And where are we going? And what kinds of things do we need to take into account when we build out this space? Like, why are we here, really?
Mm-hmm.
We're not just building a space just to like have it. It's there to support the narrative as well, right? So that's when we do what we call it just a story break, where Sam, Jen, and I will all sit down and talk through what's coming next, do a quick recap of where we're at, just so we all know, roughly what characters are involved in things and what's recently happened in the story at this point. And then we discuss what we want to do, figure out how that relates to the story, and, kind of brainstorm and do kind of a writer's room sort of a deal. And once we're all on the same page, then we kind of split back off into our silos and work on all the pieces we talked about. And then once that's done, we have another story break. So it's kind of this like reconvene, check in with the person who is in charge of the narrative, right? The seer, the prophet, whatever, and kind of work through that. So
I think what's tricky about it is that with this kind of work is that, we have the high level, it's very easy to agree on like the high level pathway about what's happening. And I mean easy in the sense of like that the high level stuff, because it's more abstracted, won't necessarily change, right? It's not quite as mutable. And so it's
easy to add that level of abstraction without worrying about any impacts on creating contradictions or whatever.
Correct. But then when it comes to like the vast majority of Jen's day-to-day work is basically writing the actual dialogue lines, right? And this is that whole like rubber meets the road problem, right? So because we've discussed, say, we're going to be going through this particular area and we're doing these particular quest for this mechanical reason, and we're this far away from a boss fight or whatever the fuck, and Seth will basically stub those in, but with placeholder dialogue that essentially is just getting us from here to there, right?
Yeah. So there'll be a quest in the game that it does exist, and you can do the quest, but you'll walk up to the character, and the dialogue will just say something like "conversation about this," right? And that's just what the character says. Just enough so that if you're playing it as a QA tester or something, then you'll know what they're asking you to do and the context of it. But the actual what is actually said and all the character and everything else will be there. None of that is in there.
So the trick then is that we have these essentially these like transformation points that can happen, where one is where we get out of the meeting, everyone's agreed on, okay, here's what's happening. Seth goes to implement stuff, and in the implementation process stumbles on some interesting idea for, it could actually play better if it was like this, or, this can wrap around to this particular region, whatever. And that could have an impact or no impact on that actual higher level thesis about where we're going, right? But it will always definitely have an impact on the actual dialogue, right? That's going to be said in those moments. And then the second part of it is when Jen then comes through to do the dialogue pass, and she's got a whole boatload of information that she's essentially also trying to weave in about referencing previous things that have happened, or making sure that things are set up appropriately to deliver on wherever we're going in the next chapter or two. So the dialogue will change a lot and starts weaving in all this other stuff, which then
but it also has to weave it in a way that's really challenging, because the game's a bunch of linear sequences of story, right? But they branch off and then come back and intersect, right? So so it's not that you can just kind of do anything. It's not, and no story games are, right? But even though it's a bunch of linear things, because you can participate in each of those lines at a different rate, or not at all, or whatever, then along any of those lines at any given point, the possible states of all the rest of the stories are just all over the place. And so that's the biggest challenge among all of the challenges with it, is how do you account for that in the dialogue and what the stories are doing, in being able to answer the question, what's going on at this point in the game right now, right?
Yeah.
Because it's actually a range of things that could be going on at that point, and you need to try to figure out how do you handle that whole range of things.
Yeah. And if you got characters that are part of the main story who are also involved in side quests that are optional, that's where things can get pretty tricky. So we kind of found is the easiest way is to try to keep those things fairly separate, right? Where you'll have side characters who have their own stories, which can kind of be based on the same backstory that the player has experienced up to that point. But if those side characters need to sort of converge back into the main story somehow, then at that point it's basically not a side quest anymore. It becomes required, and then you've got to figure out how to deal with the fact that the player can do basically 2 branches of the main story in parallel in different orders, right? So that's, and even so it's something I noticed in playing like Baldur's Gate 3, which is famous for its branching stories and stuff, right? Even in that game, one thing that you'll notice is there is essentially one through line story, and every other story that happens alongside it in a way that doesn't affect the main story. Yeah. It just kind of refers to it, and they'll have these moments. This happens multiple times throughout the game where when you're about to move into some next part of the main story, a pop-up will appear on screen and it'll say, hey, what you're about to do is going to permanently change the state of the world. So make sure you've tied up some loose ends before you proceed.
They're basically saying like, look, if you have anything you haven't done yet, we're just not like it will remain unfinished essentially.
Yeah. So essentially they just like close off whatever side quests there are. They're just like, yeah, these are done now. So you can never go back and check in. And so they do those kinds of like ratcheting things just to, otherwise, if you had a 100-hour game that has, 50 side quest storylines that can all be happening in parallel in sequence, or like in parallel with each other, but you have no idea which ones the player will be doing first or which open threads they will have left open at like major moments. And so you can't really, it's an infinite combination problem, right? Like you can't cover all those bases.
Yeah. So as far as then like basically tackling that big story, I think it comes down to really it's agreement on the abstract first between all the parties involved, as far as and also in the games it's different because we have to, it's not just like a big exposition dump the whole time. It's not how you want it to go, right? It should be ideally the player is seeing things happen or is participating in things that are happening.
Yeah, it needs to interact with the gameplay.
Yeah, so then you have a whole other layer there, which is planning out how the player moves through that overarching narrative in a way that is mechanically interesting, and then what that would mean at certain junctures. And again, that's very high level. So it's as high as basically saying, okay, in this particular biome, we want to have this overall effect that is present that the player has to deal with, and that's caused by some part of the narrative, and that's like a big thing that the people in the area are dealing with. So that kind of like, again, very high level abstract thing. And then once you've agreed just kind of like on those big beats, then the reality is like you can't, how to put it, you can't really get too bent out of shape about knowing exactly what's going to happen in the particulars, right?
Yeah, you can't plan the details.
Yeah, you cannot plan the details.
It's a fog of war thing, right? Like the direction that you're going, but what path you're going to take to get there is not clear until you're right exactly at that point. And there've been so many times where we'll sit down, we'll have a story break, we'll be like, all right, here's what's gonna happen next, like right now, what we're about to do. And we'll talk through it. We're all hyped about what's about to happen. We sit down to actually make the quests or like build out that space, and immediately we'll be like, oh shit, actually there's this other thing about this that we hadn't thought about that's going to change everything. Yeah, so now we got to get back together.
It's the same with like any really complex system, right? Where, because if you think of the story in a game context, it's not just a fully linear thing. It's just a really complex system. That's just everything's interacting with everything. And the game context is a little wider because also the world is interacting with that too, and the story's interacting with the world. There's this huge complexity of the system. And it's just like if you're working on a huge code project where it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to go add this feature. And everybody agrees like this would be a cool feature to add. You as the lead programmer think through it. You're like, yeah, we could totally do this. And then you sit down to do it. And as you start doing it, you're like, oh, fuck, wait, this also talked.
We got some unanswered questions.
And I think for the particular challenge with the narrative is unlike in like a programming context where there are all kinds of mechanisms because it's so formalized, right? There are all kinds of mechanisms you can use to like discover these things ahead of time, and there are ways to like fix them,
or crashes. It's
it crashes. You find out that it didn't work. Right? Yeah. You can not easily, but you can often very quickly discover that something has gone awry. But when it comes to story stuff, it's not like that. There's not a functional impact on the person experiencing the story, but that functionality isn't baked into the story itself, right? So there's not actually a way to detect that ahead of time.
Yeah, it doesn't self-expose. So you basically have to have people play through it and then occasionally be like, wait, didn't we? Yeah, I thought this person was worried about this thing, but now they're doing this. It seems like a little weird, you know?
Yep.
And you just, I don't know. It's what I go back and forth on this stuff because I think a lot of people get bent out of shape about the planning aspects of this. And I think, again, planning is important and you have to do it, but you really should only be doing it as far as allows you to start doing that work, because the doing of the work is what actually that's the exploratory part, like the real exploratory part. And so you really just want to make sure that at the planning phase, you're checking for things that are, it's a pre-production thing, right? It's like trying to answer questions ahead of time so that people can just go, and so that you're not going to be creating a bunch of wasted work, right? It's the reason why we talk about with the art process and stuff, and with the Game Changer, the benefit of very rapidly, if you're building world assets, throwing a gray box one into the world as soon as you have a sketch of it put together, because it turns out that as soon as Flux can walk around it, bump into it, or even smack it if it's a thing that's destructible, you get a little more information about actually it needs to be a little bigger or whatever. And all this stuff that again, they're all small tweaks, but they oftentimes can result in a tremendous amount of rework. If you have a slightly complicated object, for example, that then you're like, oh fuck, it's a little bit too big. All right, well, I got to scale it down, but then there's some artifacting and shit. You got to do all this annoying cleanup work, right? So you're trying to do the equivalent thing in the story context, right? Which is to say, can we walk through this mentally in a way that allows us to make sure we don't, just stub our toes on all sorts of dumb stuff and create a bunch of work downstream. But then beyond that, like Adam was saying, it's even harder than the art in a lot of ways, where because with the art, you can see it. So I think I would say in terms
the
of
art, you can kind of quickly look at all of the art, right?
Exactly.
You can't quickly read all of the dialogue and figure out the context of that dialogue.
Well, it's not even reading it. You have to play it. You have to play the game.
Yeah, it's
if you want to see if the story's working, set aside a day, at least, to play through a chunk of the story, not even the whole thing. Because this is another one of the challenges of in a game the size of Crashlands 2. It's you don't get to sit down and do a playthrough today. You can do a playthrough this week, maybe, because that, the game is, it's going to take dozens of hours to get through all the stuff. And so there's lots of shortcuts that we have to make. And so, there is this difficulty of trying to maintain a mental model at all times of what the story is at this point, what's relevant. And again, so that kind of comes back to what I was saying about ownership. You want to have somebody on your team who's at the nexus of all these story decisions, and they know it's their job to know that stuff.
And who has really taken ownership and is good at it. And outside of that, you need discussion. I think, again, it's these are all kind of the same problem. They just have different parts that make them really hard, right? Because in programming, it's the same thing. If I come into the Crashlands 2 code base, I don't know what the fuck's going on. But I do. But Seth does, because he's got full ownership of it. He has all that context, right? But I can slowly figure out what's going on because of the discoverability part, where the degree of discoverability that you have in the system is basically what makes it more and more possible for you to collaborate, to bring in new people, to have autonomy, and just to answer questions as you're trying to figure out, as we do the next thing, what are the constraints that we're dealing with? What's the stuff that's already there? We have to kind of navigate around, right? And so that, to me, that's the last bit when it comes to the question of how, right, is domain ownership by somebody who's on the ball, and then as many mechanisms and tools you can have, whatever those look like for the discipline, for discovery, so that you know what questions to ask is the first part. That's what requires the domain expertise and occupying that space. And then being able to get answers to those questions is that next bit. And that's where then tooling and sort of disciplined documentation and all that kind of stuff comes into play, so that you know how to get answers to things. Because even the person who's in charge of all of it, so Jen's been writing dialogue for over a year now, right? So nobody can remember that. Nobody can remember the thing they wrote a year ago. You can't.
Also, and it gets changed a lot, right? After you go through localization, even just doing playtests and stuff, let's cut this line so this speeds up, or can we change this word? So whatever you sat down and did the big think on, right, to write is not actually what's going to show up at the end of the day. It never is. Yep. And so I think there's been a few points where the overarching, I would say the overarching abstract of the story has stayed almost exactly the same since the start. But the one layer down from that, as far as like how
Still pretty abstract, but
like those major beats, it has actually shifted a lot from
because we discover what the story is by creating it.
Yeah, the particulars, and those particulars they echo up, but like they're still adhering to the really big idea about how this is going to go. But how they end up kind of rendering out in the world is actually very different than what we had originally intended. There's a twist in the overarching kind of thing that wasn't really planned ahead of time, but has been really fun to kind of discover. There's a couple of them at this point.
Yeah.
And so it's
then of course, like we didn't know that those were coming. So those twists are not even vaguely hinted at in the early game because we didn't know, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a decent chance that we will come back through and sprinkle in, like do some little updates to some moments and stuff earlier in the game to kind of foreshadow and hint at what's coming for people who are kind of sharpened on the ball and are paying attention, right? Mm-hmm. But again, it's like we're not brilliant geniuses who like knew what had the whole thing planned out. It's like no, we just stumbled our way into some cool story moments downstream.
And tried not to do things completely wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of tools, though, to your point, Adam, about like trying to think about ways to create tools or to create mechanisms so that the problems of working on a big story are more manageable. Yeah. So for us, there's two pretty cool things that we have in Crashlands 2. One is just called speed mode or speed testing mode, which is a game mode that we use just for playing through the story parts of the game, where you essentially one-shot everything. You take almost no damage. You still do get hit by stuff, but
because the idea is we want everything in the mechanically needs to stay the same.
You're still going to go places and fight this thing, or
because how the mechanics intersect with the story, right? Because if you just give yourself all the equipment, then now the parts of the story that intersect with unlocking equipment, now you can't test properly.
Yep. Yeah, and you run super fast in this mode, and all of your crafting just takes one component. So there's like the recipes are totally collapsed, so you can just like make stuff.
Yeah, so you're still playing the whole ass game, right? Just everything.
However, you could also call it boring as fuck mode, because one of the interesting things about trying to tell a story like this in a game that's also sort of an open world crafting game is many aspects of the story exist to create space for the gameplay. So, we'll say head over to this place. And so you have to, traverse your way through some new zone to get to some new place. Now, you could just directly beeline over to that new place if you wanted to, right? And just go right to the next quest. But in actual gameplay, when you're not in cheating speed mode, you have other stuff that you want to do, right? Because enemies hurt. And so you want to craft armor, and you want better weapons so that you can fight creatures better. You want better harvesting equipment. So you're always going out in the world and collecting things and
you
looking
got a bunch
for
of
recipes.
You actually have tons of reasons to interact with the game world that aren't related to the story, right? And that's the reality of how most survival games work. Almost none of them have stories, right? Or most crafting games. Just about none of them have stories because there's plenty of motivation that the player just sort of generates automatically by happening to be in the world that you have created, right?
Yeah. And because it's really hard to make something that does both, because they have different pressures on what makes a good story game versus what makes a good crafting. Because crafting is all about the sense of openness coupled with the practical hierarchy of things stacking,
progressing through.
Yeah. And a story is a linear thing. It just one thing happens after the next, right? And tying those two things together in a way that doesn't make the whole thing feel extremely linear, right? So that because each one can make the other one feel more linear and reveal more of the underlying game mechanics. So it's a huge challenge to make something that does both of those at the same time.
Yeah, and we think a lot about. There's this term ludonarrative dissonance, which is used to describe the idea that in many games, the storytelling actually detracts from the gameplay and vice versa.
It's even more, I guess it's more specific than that, which is there's a collision present where let's say it's a game all about saving people, but all you do is shoot people, right? It's there's a weird you
There's
cannot.
that, or even a thing like something that always cracks me up is like if I'm playing WoW, okay, and there'll be a quest and it'll be like, we got to rescue these people, right? And they'll have like 50 people like trapped under rubble all around, and the quest will be like 8 people rescued, 0 out of 8, and so you just walk up and like as soon as you rescue that 8th person, like the 9th person is right there, and you're like, all right, bye, and you just fucking leave, right?
Exactly.
Where it's like the game isn't gonna ask you to just click on 50 people to get them out of rubble because that's boring. They want to have you rescue just enough people that you kind of go out into the zone and see some stuff. And
and every game at some point gives up, right? And I think it's just important. Like you cannot. It's very, very hard to have a game that I guess there's a very good question, which is it even a worthy goal to get rid of ludonarrative dissonance, right? And I think to me the answer is like probably not. It's good to.
Well, it's about
possible.
keeping it limited.
It's just recognizing that it exists, right? Yeah. And knowing when you're making a choice where you're like, all right, it is a video game, so yeah, you're gonna rescue like a couple people, and then you can get the fuck out of here because that'd be boring to dig up everybody, whatever.
You have to decide what level of jank is acceptable, right? For the end 100%. User. And I don't know, because I did my play test a couple weeks ago now of the first act, and I stumbled into like it's surprisingly few problems given how difficult it is. And the problems I ran into were all just like little pieces of jank, where I was like, oh, this character said this, but I feel like they shouldn't have known about that. Like that didn't feel like that quite made sense, Right. And so it's one of those, it's like, I noted those, but at the same time I was like, these are minor, and if they don't get addressed, then it's
doesn't
fine.
really hurt anything,
because players, if they even notice at all, will just be like, oh, that was a little weird. And they'll move on because that's expected in a video game context where there's just like, there's enough complexity going on that there's going to be some jank in which characters know what, when, and, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. So it kind of reminds me though of like, there's the joke in like DevOps about security people on software teams, which is that, and really this can happen to any discipline, but it's basically when people get overly, or try to overly burden the product with solving the particulars of just one domain's problems. Yeah. And not recognizing that like you're not ever going to make bug-free code, right? Or a bug-free game, a game that can never crash.
You're never going to make unhackable code.
Yeah, you're never going to make a story that, especially in a video game context, that like where every single thread is perfectly tied up by the end of it. You're never going to make
no conflicts where you said one thing here and something else there.
Yeah, and you're not going to make a game in particular that doesn't have some kind of ludonarrative dissonance like poking at it somewhere because it is a game, right? And so it's just about being aware of it. And so part of it is also that's been an interesting one because Jen actually does like sci-fi novel and short story background, right? So there is no ludonarrative dissonance when you're just writing a story because it's just a story. There's nothing to dissonant against. You know what I mean? Like there's no ludo. There's no ludo. So
yeah, and you can still have narrative dissonance, like just within itself, right? But it's also more addressable and easier to spot because
and more of a problem.
It's all in the text, and you can go start to finish, and
and it's also more a problem, right? Because that's the only thing that there is the story, right? Versus
you don't have as much grace and forgiveness on behalf of your audience when they go, and you can also feel that too, like in a novel. Like if I see like one typo in a novel, it throws me off because they're like
it reminds you that somebody wrote it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
they're so rare.
Yeah. And so there's actually a very low tolerance for any kind of mistake, like in the context of a linear novel, right? But as the complexity of the thing grows and people understand that it grows, and also I think it's the same, like if novels tended to have typos, I wouldn't notice. You know what I mean?
It's true. Yeah.
So in the same sense, like video games tend to have some jank with respect to how the story intersects with the gameplay, because there's just it's prohibitively expensive, hugely prohibitively expensive to ensure that it doesn't.
Well, it's also not one thing. The point, right?
Yeah, it's not the point.
I guess it's like with the UIs or whatever else, where it's like because this is one thing that comes up a lot internally, which is always a question of like how intensely to try and make sure that someone can see something in particular, right? And you have this problem, which is like it's always the case that some people will miss some stuff or need to see something more strongly or whatever else. But if you start doing this to every single element, every single one, right? Whether it's HP, whether it's I don't know, player character,
every single thing that you need to do for a quest gets highlighted and is glowing, or something like that.
Like the more of this you do, the weirder the whole thing becomes, and it just actually stops working. And again, it's because the one piece of the puzzle, which is like the UI and UX, needs to be tight enough starts becoming a whole different thing in the same way the narrative can, where it's like the narrative needs to be so good that blah, but it's like, it doesn't actually need, it's all of them are serving the broader, bigger purpose. And as soon as one of them starts getting a little bit too big and trying to take up too much space, you start seeing these hilarious things happen where like you could tell someone cared way too much about X when the game just still wasn't working, like it's not actually a fun game, but has perfect it has no ludonarrative dissonance, but it's not fun to play. And it's like, well,
I mean, the only way to have that is to just not have a story. I mean,
essentially, yes.
Like Minecraft
or
has
not
no
have a
ludonarrative
game.
dissonance.
One of the two.
Or not have a game. Yep.
Yeah. And the thing that we actually try to focus on, as opposed to trying to minimize ludonarrative dissonance, is how do we have ludonarrative synergy?
Yeah.
How do we make it so that the way that we're telling the story and the types of stories that we tell actually amplify the gameplay, make the gameplay more fun, and vice versa, right? Because like for example, NPCs don't die in Crashlands, as in like they don't take damage and they don't go into combat with things.
Yeah, they can die from a story.
They can die if we decide they die in a story, right? But if we open up the ability to kill the NPCs, which is what is present in say a game like Baldur's Gate, then we have to suddenly account for every scenario where an important NPC is now dead, but we wanted to use that NPC to tell a story later, right? And one of the funniest things that I see is like people who, this was especially true when Baldur's Gate 3 kind of first hit the scene, people would come in and they'd be like, this game sucks. I'm doing an evil playthrough where I kill every person that I encounter and the story is garbage, right? And it's like, there's nobody around
There's no story.
for there to be a story. Like stories are about people.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Like a story is rarely about nobody, right? Like somebody is in the story.
Unless it's just
you
like
kill
a volcano
everyone-
has erupted. If it's completely people free but lots of story, then it's just the environment is extremely chaotic, right? That's the
Yeah, and at that point, it's like, all right, you're basically just back in Minecraft, right? Where it's like, all right, it's just you versus the environment now because there's nobody around. And so it's this weird thing where, we discussed these kinds of things early in development, and we were like, the problem there is like it feels like a choice, but it's a bad one. And it makes so like if a player goes down that path, it's I guess interesting that that's possible,
but
it's really fucking boring. Yeah. Which isn't to say that we're like trying to dictate how people are supposed to enjoy the game. It's more the cost of doing that is insanely high from a development perspective, and it only gives people a somewhat boring and confusing alternative path that they could like fall into on accident.
I think there's another funny example of this in Crashlands 2, which some people may have seen it from the demo, which is that if you're in combat with something, so let's say you're being chased by a creature, but then someone has a quest for you and you talk to them, or you just happen to trigger a quest moment because you walk by something that Flux remarks on, right? That takes control of the camera and stuff. Then the creature's de-aggro. So anything that's attacking you literally is like, ooh, they're having a conversation. I'm just going to scoot out real quick. Sorry, And it's hilarious because like you could have like a trail of every single creature in the whole mantle coming after you, for example.
You could have just a tsunami of demons coming banging down your door.
And you just talk to someone and they're like, oh, okay.
Oh, my bad.
It's not even
we'll wait over here.
Yeah, it's not even quite like we'll wait. Like they don't come back into combat with you after.
Yeah, they just
wander off. They're like, all right, bye. And so again, it's one of those things where it's like,
they wander off, but there actually is a sort of behind the scenes grudge system it literally is called in the code. It's called grudges, where creatures do hold grudges where if you did fight them, if they're normally a passive creature,
I forgot about that.
right? Then the next time you encounter that creature, it'll remember. It'll remember.
So there's a good chance that combat will restart if you go back into the fray, right?
Yeah, or if the creature's like still close enough.
Yeah, but again, it has to be one of those things where you ask the question like, okay, how else could you solve that? And it's like, you can make it so you can't have quests start if you're in combat.
Well, then you can miss things.
Then you can miss a lot.
If you run past a character, or like past a spot in the world that's supposed to trigger a diet, like a scene or something like that. If you're in combat and you just like run past it, it'll never trigger, and the player will never know why. They'll never know they missed something.
Or because creatures wander around while you're talking, right? They're still living. They don't just freeze. They go wandering around. So you could be talking to someone and then like
aggroed.
They're like, hey, could you like just meet me in the house? And then boom, now you're in combat and you got to kill this thing or run away or whatever before. It makes it all kind of weird in a different way.
Well, and you have to, it depends on what these things are for. Because like in a game like Crashlands 2, most of the combat you're experiencing is with creatures that are effectively resources, right? Yeah. Individual combat encounters are not important. Correct. And they're certainly not so important that they should take precedence over individual story events that are important because they happen. Every story event happens exactly once, right? As you're working through it.
That's true.
And so making that exchange is pretty, and I know like from my own playthrough, like I felt those times when it happened, which are actually fairly rare, but I would, because I actually didn't know what to expect because I didn't even know that part of the design. And so I would be like in combat and be like, oh shit, I need to like go talk to, or like I would just suddenly start talking to somebody because some of them would get triggered by proximity. Mm-hmm. And my first thought was like, oh no, because like I'm going
to die in this conversation now.
And then discovering that, the creature just stopped giving a shit. I was like, okay, great. That's really useful. And then I moved on with my life and that just became part of my mental model of how the game
It's
works.
a practical approach, right?
It doesn't even matter.
It's better.
Because I mean, the alternative would be for us to be like, okay, now we're going to try to make it so that like quest dialogue can be delivered while you're actively fighting enemies. I was like, well, that would be weird because then the NPC would be just having a casual conversation with you and you would be casually speaking back to them while doing backflips and stabs and whatever else. That feels weird. So, all right, I guess we'll have the NPCs fight too. And that way you can both be, okay, now we got a whole new set of problems and then it's just stupid. So
yeah. And again,
dial that back.
There are tons of ways to make something like this not be even possible to happen, right? Which is like Adam's point about essentially locking combat encounters in some way. So I played Dungeons of Hinterberg recently, which I thought was great. By the way, it's on Game Pass. It's kind of Zelda-y, but they do this really fun split up of how the day works, where you kind of in the morning you like plan your day, in the afternoon you go do a dungeon basically somewhere in the Alps, killing monsters and stuff.
Of course, yeah.
As one does in the Alps.
The Alps are known for their monsters.
They are. But what was interesting is that they do this magic circle thing, which I actually enjoyed a lot. I saw in the reviews. In the reviews, a lot of people were kind of annoyed by it, but I immediately got why, which is that they basically set up these little encounters where you might see some monsters chilling somewhere. And as soon as you get close enough to them, they draw this like little magic fire circle around you and you can't get out. You have to kill them to leave, right? So, and this happens. Like that is how combat
it's basically it makes me think of like in like a Pokemon or Final Fantasy game, right? Where like you're walking out in the world and suddenly you're just in a combat encounter and it's a whole different thing that you can't just like
have to solve
unless there's an escape mechanic that's part of the combat.
Yes,
right?
And so this is one of the things we've dealt with actually quite a bit, which is like the fact that you can just
run past
everything makes a lot of stuff much harder to do on the design side, right? Because we have
to make you want to fight things and want to defeat them because you normally don't have to.
Yeah, the only thing that you are basically locked in a room with is bosses. Those are the only ones where like you are literally trapped. You cannot escape. And then occasionally you can get trapped in a room with like robots. Because of how
we do have special types of doors that we call combat doors, which are doors that will not change their state if you are in combat. So if they're currently open and you're in combat, they won't close. And if they are currently closed and you're in combat, they won't open. So if we have those types of doors and you enter a room, right, you get far enough into the room that the door you just came through also closes. So now all the doors in this room are closed.
And then we spawn some enemies.
And we spawn some enemies in there. It's like, okay, you're trapped in the room. But if you die, you're not trapped in the room then. You teleport back home and now you're free to do whatever. And then you can walk back in.
Yeah,
or, you could potentially like walk back in and bait the enemy out of the room, right? And then just kind of run past them at that point or something. Yeah, there's always ways.
It's interesting because it's like there's that, and it has been a thing for us on occasion where like we want people to have already fought X thing or to have like this more epic kind of fight sequence in some place, but corralling them is not something we wanted to do. And so it's not really baked into we don't have there's not a good tool for it outside of a few of these like little ones we can use, but even those are kind of oftentimes able to be bypassed, right? So I saw this in the Dungeons of Hinterberg one, and to me I was like, oh, it's actually very smart because it turns they get to control the specifics of the combat encounter, right? With different kinds of enemies, like how tactical it is, whatever. But then also they know that if you go past that place that you have killed those things, there's a fact of it. And Baldur's Gate actually has the same benefit in lots of ways because you can't, I guess you could just sneak through everything. Like you can sneak past just about everything.
Oh yeah. Somebody made a video where they were like, can I beat Baldur's Gate without ever being in combat?
Did they just sneak through the whole thing?
Yeah, they just stealthed through the whole fucking game, right? It was like it's possible. You miss almost everything.
Yeah. You don't do anything, I guess, right? Yeah, you're just like the wind at that point, arriving at the final destination, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the advantage of having something that's that sort of flexible, But yeah, it is the case. Like for most people who play Baldur's Gate, combat encounters feel pretty locked in. Mm-hmm. Like you enter a space and people are like, hey, what are you doing here? Well, you're in combat now, right? Yeah. And it's turn-based. And so if you want to escape, you have to use your actions and stuff in the combat in order to – there's like a little button that you can hit to flee combat, which teleports you back to your camp. But you have to be a certain distance away from enemies
it's really hard to do, yeah.
And it's a party-based game, so it only applies to one of your characters at a time. Mm-hmm. So, like, you'll have to individually have each of your characters run away fast enough and far enough that each of them can escape, which kind of, it can be difficult. In some cases, you literally can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's a lot of benefit to having that tight of control over a system like that. And of course, you don't get much of the open world, just kind of running around feel in particular with that. But I think you get a different kind, which is you can basically tell more interesting stories and stuff like that as soon as you have more control, right? So there's always that balance to play with when it comes to figuring out exactly, again, like you could agree on the overarching stuff, but when you get in the details, that really ends up shaping.
Some things you thought would be fine and easy to do end up not really being. So, So before we get to the next question, I did mention we have two tools that we use to build out the story. The other one is the idea of snapshots.
Yes.
Which has proven to be so valuable.
And the first one, in case you forgot, was the speed running thing.
Speed mode. Yeah. Speed mode. So the snapshots are basically at any given point as a developer, when we're playing through the campaign, we can just go into our developer menu and just create a save snapshot. So what that does is it just saves the game. Well, and then it puts it onto our server, and you can name it.
I guess it's just a save, actually, right?
It's a save that is unchanging.
Yes.
So like if Sam is working on a quest and he wants to be able to play through that quest and test it and stuff, then he'll make a save snapshot that is right before that quest starts. So he'll be standing there near the NPC and blah blah blah. And then he can play through the quest, and if it turns out that it's not working properly or whatever, he can just go back to that snapshot and start a new save from that point and then play through it again. So this is our QA team.
But you can change because the snapshot is for like the state of.
It's just a fixed starting.
It's a fixed point, but the game itself can still change underneath it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So that way you can then tweak some stuff and then replay it from that same starting point with all your same equipment, same spot on the map, same statuses on all of your quests, et cetera, et cetera. But now something about the game has changed. So you can now say like, okay, given the same starting point, if I make this change, what is the impact on the experience?
Yep. Yeah. And that's been super useful for QA testing where, sometimes our QA team will be like, oh, I found this weird thing that happens. I've made a snapshot so you can go see it, right? So they could just exactly drop me as the programmer, just drop me into that spot so I can just see what happens and make it work. And it's been really useful for just developing story where making a snapshot at the point where you're about to go into the next bit of story content makes it super, super fast to like develop those quests, play through them, see how they work, make adjustments, play through them again without having to manually go and like try to recreate all of the
universe
equipment
up until that
and
point.
everything. Yeah.
And the other part of this that we haven't even gotten into is localization, right? Because all this stuff is already basically impossible and really hard. And then when you want to localize it, then now you got to provide all this information. Well, I won't go into like all the stuff about this, but except for the part
we have several episodes about localization.
Except for the part that intersects with this gameplay challenge, right? Because the other thing that both of these two things give us, the speed run and the snapshots, is that those are also things we can let the loc quality assurance or just the loc team also use, so that now they're trying to figure out, what does this actually look like in context? Like they can have starting points to get there rather than having to play the game for 30 hours first to find that point, right? Or because we do localization in big chunks, so like Act 1 is localized already. Pretty quick, we're going to start localization on Act 2, right? But we don't want the loc QA to have to play the first act first, right? Because they've already done QA on that content. And sure, some of it's changed a little bit, but there's too much content. It's not worth like redoing Loc QA all over again, right? So we want to give them a snapshot where they can then start basically at Act 2 and with all the things that we think make the most sense for them to have at that point and so on, so they can get started that way. So, and this thing that we've discovered over and over again is that when we make tools for QA purposes or for development purposes and so on, every single tool we make to make the development experience easier also makes other stuff easier too, right? And so they're always really good investments.
Yeah, but those tools really didn't start coming online in a big way until I started working on content, because I'm the one who makes those tools. And if I get annoyed by something and I can make a tool to fix it, I will, right? But if somebody else is like, hey, this thing's annoying to me, I'm like, yeah, but like I'm in the middle of some other stuff. So
how do I prioritize it against this backlog of other annoying things?
Oh yeah, like if you want me to
that is an important
stop working on this,
is make sure that the people involved with like doing all of this stuff either have some mechanism at their disposal to like do their own tool development automations or whatever, or that they loop in people on occasion who do, either just to observe and so they can actually get a better sense of like what does it actually take to do this stuff, or ideally so that they actually have to dog food it, actually have to use it themselves so they can see what the experience actually feels like. Because it's the same for me. Like anytime I dip into any game maker programming at all ever, the moment I start doing anything, I'm like, oh, I need to update some Stitch stuff, which is our tool for doing our own development work. Because the moment I start touching it, I'm like, oh, this part sucks, and I can fix it. And so that's I do. Yeah.
All right, let's get to one final question. We got like 5 minutes. We can squeeze this in quick. We could do it. This question comes from NargatruckeeDippatub, who says,
little TruckeeDippatub,
who says, hey guys, I was listening to the first episode about Seth's space game, and it made me wonder. So probably about that game Absolute Units, I think, which was the space game that's where every pixel is 1 meter, and tried to make a space game out of that. Very hard to do, turns out. This question is sports simulation, FIFA, NHL, etc., kind of cursed as a game genre? The industry's aim and the players' want seems to be about providing increasingly realistic simulations instead of making the gameplay more fun. In my opinion, they've hit the point of diminishing returns, and this is why virtually the same game is released year after year, and the reviews keep going down. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a question of how you innovate mechanically on those, especially some like the really established franchises, right? Because you wouldn't want to, let's say you take like 2K and you're like, ooh, we found a really...
Madden? Was that Madden? No,
NBA 2K, sorry.
Okay.
Let's say you take that one and you're like, okay, not just is it like updated with essentially all the current athletes and stuff, but we're going to introduce like a different way of doing free throws. There's like a way more mechanically intense thing. So you feel more pressure when you do it, whatever. Just some stuff.
We're going to add basketball royale, where 100 basketball players drop out of a plane.
Well, that would be different.
That's a whole other game. I'm saying like even if you take the existing thing and then
you're saying take a new way to model the real game.
Yeah. To try to try to capture something about the play experience, like the actual basketball experience converted into, a video game format. In a franchise context, there is especially one that is both as old as all of the sports games are now, but then also as basically the easiest profit-making machines that I would say, like as far as franchises go, that exist currently. And I mean that in terms of like the questions are answered. Models. Yeah, you know who the characters are going to be because they're literally real. And then also from a overall mechanical perspective, like the player base doesn't probably really want you to change shit very much.
Football is football. Yeah. Basketball is basketball.
So the underlying simulation you're doing about it can change, but like also not too much. It's not, people don't really want they don't want physics on the football actually in terms of like it somehow when you throw it, let's say if you're playing as a quarterback or something like that in one of these games, then when you do the throw, you have to like do a fucking quick time event to get the spiral right, and that affects its passage through air. Like nobody wants that because it's not actually what it feels like to play football, right? And so I think the tricky bit is basically then when you're trying to answer this question, like what do people really want? I feel like a lot of times what you see in these is like these are the perfect cases for these graphics. They just keep pumping the graphics up, right? It's more realistic.
They just want it to look better.
Yeah. But it's also the only change you can make to that actually will be welcome, right?
Yes, I think that's the trick.
Yeah, every other change, no matter what people say, the fact is that nobody likes change. Gamers are no exception to that. And when you're coming to a franchise thing, like even if you do have a really good thing, we're like, ooh, like we can make you feel like more like whatever the particular kind of experience we're trying to deliver here about what it means to like be playing a football on a TV or whatever, right? Whatever that experience is supposed to be, we found a better input system for this particular part of the game that we think will make it like really deliver better than that experience. It doesn't matter if that's true even, because everybody who's playing this has played the last 10 years of it also, right?
Yeah.
And their immediate reaction is going to be, what the fuck? Why did you change this? Right. And they're going to hate
Well, it's the problem of everybody going, I want this to be better, but not different.
Yeah, it needs to be better.
Like,
but
I want it,
and that's where
better,
graphics,
but don't change anything.
Yeah, and that's where
then what the
graphics
fuck
come
do
into
you
play.
do?
Yeah. Because the graphics can keep getting better to a point, but we really kind of are.
We are kind of capping out. Yeah.
And then like animations can get better to a point. Like everything can get better to a point, and that point is it looks real, right? Mm-hmm. And once you're there, that was the only thing that was really allowed to fundamentally change, and now it's not. Mm-hmm. So then the only thing you're doing is
that's also a matter of diminishing returns. Like things can look more real, but they will always look more real at a slower rate than they did before, right? Because if you look at like, so I remember playing NFL Blitz,
so fun
on the Nintendo 64.
Yep.
And that was fun because it wasn't a simulation. It was fucking weird.
It was hyperbole of football, basically. It was like
because they couldn't capture all of just the rules of football, right?
Yeah.
So
and
they had to make something that felt
so
like
much
football, but wasn't.
Yeah.
And I haven't played I have played football games on consoles and stuff since then, but I put them down almost immediately.
They're too real for you.
I was like, it just feels like I'm just watching football now.
Yeah, which is who it's for.
I just happen to be holding a controller.
Yeah, it's for people who love watching football, love yelling at the players to do what they want, and now can like make them do what they want. Right? Mm-hmm. That's who these games are for. Which is not true of that first one. That first one was like for people who like the idea of football as a game itself, right? Rather than like the NFL specifically. And
now, for some reason, my brain is going here. But hear me out. So one of the big things in these sports games is all about getting real players in there, right? That's why they release new ones every year. It's like the teams change, the players change, and it's like all updated stuff, right? Do you guys remember Celebrity Deathmatch?
Yes.
That clay animated
that was
thing
on MTV Swim or something? Or no,
it was on some,
yeah.
Yeah, where they would like do these like caricatures of celebrities. I remember I don't remember many of them, but I do remember 9 Inch Nails, as in Trent Reznor, the musician who goes by 9 Inch Nails, and he actually had like 9-inch like spikes coming out of his fingers, and the deaths were brutal. It was like Mortal Kombat level, but it was clay animation, so it was horrifying in concept, but kind of hilarious to watch. I'm sure it doesn't hold up in retrospect, so I'll go back and watch it, but. It would be kind of interesting if there was a celebrity deathmatch video game where they license, they reach out to celebrities and like, hey, do you want us to like make you a fighter in our celebrity deathmatch game, right? And every year they release a new game with a new roster.
Is that the fidelity is too high for that because
well, that's why it would have to be stylized. It would have to be like
it would have to be really stylized because like, it would have to be a cartoon or something because I
almost claymation, right?
Yeah, like I already can't play Mortal Kombat because it is so fucking intense.
Yeah, I liked Mortal Kombat back in the day when it was clearly a cartoon.
Yeah.
Right. And like now when they zoom in and they show like bones cracking on the inside and like spines being ripped out. And it's like this. Okay.
I enjoy it just purely from an animation perspective because it's like
it's impressive.
Wild. But even just the creativity of how they're just executing people is just shockingly, it's just unbelievable, right? The whole time. So I enjoy it for that. I'll watch the basically recaps of like whatever the fatalities are that they've added. Every DLC, I'll check it. I haven't actually played it, but I watched those because I'm like, this is wild. So the animation department is just going to town on this, and it is so fun to see. I mean, it's gross. That's the result of it. Is it's gross, but fun.
Yeah. So what celebrity would you guys play as?
I think.
Who do you think would have the best moves?
I think to Adam's point, I guess with where things are, Celebrity Deathmatch is at a time where
involved. Yeah,
Celebrity Deathmatch happened at a time where like everything felt like a little more optimistic, and like I guess the
And,
internet was
and
really a thing.
not every celebrity was involved in some kind of sex abuse scandal.
Yeah, well, also like not every celebrity was also like already.
I guess they were. We just didn't know.
Yeah, more so that they weren't already being like bullied online, which is what happens just to all of them now. So I don't know. It feels different now. I feel like I wouldn't feel good about it at all. I wouldn't. If I was a celebrity, I wouldn't be like, yeah, sign me up to like get murdered on TV a bunch. Like, no. Absolutely.
Yeah,
not,
just brutally and horribly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's what a horror movie is for when somebody has signed up for it. But there's a different thing.
That's an interesting thought.
But I think the part with the game though is that like, and I think it's a lot of why I don't like Mortal Kombat is because like because you're the one doing it, right? Like when you're playing. Because like if I just watch the animations, it doesn't bother me that much. But it's like the idea of me being the one like ripping a person's body in half or whatever, in this like slow, deliberate, horrifying way.
That has actually put me away from like playing shooters and stuff. Even for some reason, like there's a certain point in my life
where they got too real and
games got too real, and the idea of like getting the headshot on somebody and watching their head snap back and like the red mist fly out. Where I'm just like, I don't like it. This is not the Unreal Tournament of my day, right? Where like you'd shoot somebody and they wouldn't even have ragdoll physics. They would just kind of like do a death animation of like laying down while flying off of the map. It's like, all right, this is so clearly fake that it's clear it's a game, But yeah, as they push more and more to that realism, I feel like I'm not comfortable.
Some things get a little
with it.
A little less fun.
Yeah.
And I feel like because I've watched like clips of some of the modern shooter games, but other kind of things in that genre where like the violence is like, and in lots of games violence is the core mechanism, but it's the degree of how much you're just like doing real violence, But like things where I'm watching how it works and it's so cool, like the mechanisms that are involved, like the design elements of like how it all works and like how cool the shit is that these like modern games are doing. But the moment that I see like what happens in action where it's just too visceral and too real, then I'm like, oh, like I guess I just don't get to do this, because it's just too
uncomfortable.
Have you played Doom? Because
I have, yeah. Because Doom I like because you're fighting horrible demons that are trying to get you,
Also, they're
just doing their job, Adam. They're just trying to put food on their families. Okay,
yeah. Hey, they got mortgages.
They're demon families.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those ones where like it's like I know it's not technically cartoonized, but to me it is.
It is, yeah.
Like, because it's fantasy. It's fake monsters that don't exist.
But yeah, it's high res, but like cartoon weirdness. Do you know what I mean? I don't know how to exactly to describe that, but
the big thing is like it's not people. It doesn't feel like it's people. I think that's the. Or it also doesn't feel like it's like creatures that are just doing they're just doing their best, It just feels like there's horrible monsters that are trying to get you, and it's like, that feels like it makes sense.
Punch them in the eye.
Do you guys remember? I think it was probably in about 2009 or so when we showed our grandpa Left 4 Dead.
Oh,
and he was like, I don't like this.
Yeah.
I feel like these. I feel like I'm killing people, and that makes me really uncomfortable. And we're like, oh, they're zombies. Like they're already dead. Did not register at all. Like that somebody would even have a hang up about like killing things in a video game, right? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, I can see it. Sure, I can see it.
Yeah. I'll still kill zombies. Doesn't bother me at all. But but as soon as
they're already dead, it's fine.
Yeah, but as soon as it's just like people, that it's too.
It's too much.
Fucked up.
So yeah, the simulation type games like that, hyperrealism has a diminishing return, and it does kind of take you away from being able to do more interesting, stylized, cartoonish, goofy things. There's probably why, like these sports games are just like, it's just basketball.
But I think it's when you don't get to choose, because you don't get to choose any of the constraints, right? When it comes to like, if what you're trying to do is like create a war simulator or create a physical game simulator, right? Where what you're trying to do is make it like you're trying to match the constraints of that external system. Then all of your creativity has to go into like, how do you make it feel like you're actually participating in that, right? Yeah. And that's where all of it has to go. You don't get to say like, but wouldn't it be cool though if like if the basketball could just catch on fire, you know, and like, wouldn't it be cool if when you were dribbling, you could do a mega dribble and it would like flex the floor and shoot all the players around you off into the distance, you know, like,
Or if there's one hoop and it flies around erratically and there's no gravity and everybody has jetpacks. Basketball.
Yeah, exactly.
Quidditch. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, that's you could make a game out of that, but you can't make an NBA game out of it.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to like that. So, yeah, interesting. Yeah, if you're into those types of games, though, I mean, it's fine. Just you got to accept that you're getting what you're getting. Yeah, and that's really not going to change.
And it's in the same way that if you're into sports, like you watch your sports teams every year over year, right? Like nothing fundamentally changes about that experience. It's just new players and then new individual events that unfold that are the same shape as all the events that have unfolded before, right? But it makes sense that the games exactly reflect that experience of professional sports, right? Which is like, it just is what it is. And I think for the
it
most
never
part,
changes. You know, if you're a Vikings fan, you're never going to win the Super Bowl.
Yeah, so I think for
I don't know if
most-
that's actually true, but I think it's something that
It's just the rules.
yeah,
those are the rules.
But I think that's how. But I think that is actually why, in terms of like that genre, it doesn't matter that it's at a point of diminishing returns, right? Because the point of diminishing is the same point at which the sport itself is at diminishing returns, right?
Yes.
And so I don't think it matters at all. I think people who are into it will still every year buy it for the update. Like there used to be a lot of reasons to buy those games, right? Because they were better.
Because they were getting way
simulations.
better.
But I think it's going to move into, again, like the same kind of motivation people have for just watching sports every year in the first place, which is like, that's now the primary motivation is like everything is up to date. You got all the new people.
I don't know why they don't just make these games into just a subscription one game. Like just you just subscribe to FIFA and it just gets updated.
I mean, I'm sure.
That's basically how it works.
That's
right?
coming. I'm sure that's coming. Yeah.
I'm sure
It's coming.
It's coming. Or if it's not, they've decided they could just make a lot more money this way.
Yeah. One of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. So hope that answers the question. That's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampra Acosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost the game up the charts and help it have a successful launch. We'd appreciate it tremendously. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.